Ladies and gentlemen, last time we concluded our lecture on Mr. Gorbachev and his proposals for radical perestroika, and I described these proposals as an existential moment for him and for the Soviet Union. Would reform be? Would a new union be born in the wake of the old one, or would reform at the last minute be blocked? We saw that in the economic sphere, Mr. Gorbachev walked up to the brink of a free market system, but he stopped. We saw that politically, he went very far toward de-Stalinizing the country by abrogating Article number 6 of the Soviet Constitution and thereby eliminating the Communist Party's monopoly over power, along with all sorts of other political reforms. If you add up the impact of radical perestroika, you find that economically, people's standard of living did not improve, and that the fact that radical perestroika failed created momentum psychologically and politically for a real experiment with the market. That is, for the destruction in toto of the old Stalinist command economy and an experiment with real market forces. So Gorbachev's failure set the stage for the first years of Yeltsin's tenure as the president of the new independent Russian Republic. Mr. Gorbachev's buzzword, glasnost, publicity, which had become by 1990 something more than a buzzword. It had become something that would fairly be translated as freedom of expression, unrestricted right to publish opinions. This glasnost had given to Soviet citizens immeasurably more individual political freedom than they enjoyed earlier, but it had also weakened the fabric of the Union because it had permitted the expression of nationalist ideologies in the Republic. It had permitted talk about Republican autonomy, about secession of republics from the Soviet Union, and indeed about national independence. The political reforms of Gorbachev within the Soviet Union were astonishing. In the in the legislative elections to the Congress of People's Deputies, there was the first free and open voting since elections to the Constituent Assembly in 1917. For the first time, the structure of the state was put on the national agenda as a matter to be thought about. Whereas before, what existed was an undivided government, that is, the party controlled all of the branches of government, judicial, executive, and legislative. Now it became possible under the new dispensation to think that a real division of powers might become possible. So Mr. Gorbachev achieved something, but whether it augured for the reconstruction of the Soviet system and its revitalization, or made for the rebirth of a new set of societies independent of the Soviet Union, was something that had yet to be decided. It was decided in 1991 in a series of quite dramatic events. One force that was in play in 1991 was the last gasp of the hardliners, of the skeptics about reform, of Gorbachev's opponents in the bureaucracy and the army and security services. The hardliners had pressed him not to adopt the Stalin plan for marketization. They pressed him to use force in suppressing nationalist independent movements in the republics. Gorbachev yielded to this pressure in the case of the economic sphere and the Stalin plan. He did not yield for the most part, with a couple of exceptions in Georgia in 1989 and Lithuania in 1990, and with threats and blandishments in 1991. He resisted the hardliners to the end. The security police was especially opposed to decentralization of authority. Mr. Khrushchev, who was the head of the KGB under Gorbachev, advertised himself publicly as a reformer, but privately he worried very much about the power slipping out of the hands of the government. And the old party guard, people like Fyodor Ligachev, warned Gorbachev, you have gone too far already, pull back, not for your own sake, but for the sake of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was assailed by other forces as well, by the forces of the nationalist movements in the republics. By 1990, he had plainly given up on the Baltic states, and it was recognized as a political reality that sooner or later they would be independent. By 1991, it was possible that the leadership was recognizing that the Asian southern periphery would have to be given up as well. The Uzbeks and the Georgians and the Armenians and so on. And there was an even bigger concern that faced Mr. Gorbachev in Ukraine. There was a president who didn't speak very much about independence. This is Mr. Kravchuk, but who constantly ignored Gorbachev, constantly ignored Moscow, and quietly, a Ukrainian friend of mine told me, independence was de facto achieved before 1991 in Ukraine. Most worrisome was the Russian Republic, where Mr. Yeltsin, who had thrown off the Communist Party, walked out of a convention, declared himself root and branched opposed to the party just at a time when anti-party sentiment in the country was reaching its peak. Mr. Yeltsin was elected the president of the Russian Republic. Now, it's worthwhile for us to remember, he was elected president of the Russian Republic while the Soviet Union still existed. He was within the Soviet Union a rival to Gorbachev because both of them were in Moscow, and he was within the Soviet Union a danger to the Soviet system because Russia was the most populous, the most powerful republic if it should attempt to shuck off the all-union level of representation. Well, in August of 1991, the first of the dramatic clashes that we are familiar with, and maybe we all recall occurred. This was the so-called attempted coup d'etat against Mr. Gorbachev that was organized by Khrushchev, by the vice president of the Soviet Union, a man called Gennady Yanayev, an alcoholic with visibly trembling hands when he appeared on television, and certain hardliners in the army and security forces, Boris Pugo, and there were a number of others. Now, formally, Gorbachev was not deposed by the coup. It was said that he was suffering from ill health. Gorbachev himself claimed that in Foros, which was his vacation retreat in the south, that communications were cut off, that he was not held at gunpoint precisely, but he was under house arrest for a number of hours. Muscovites and people elsewhere in the Soviet Union got the news that a state of emergency had been declared, and if the pattern was to follow the old regional pattern of politics, the insertion of tanks would come, the arrest of the political leadership in opposition would come, and the installation or reinstallation of the old order would happen. But the coup collapsed in 3 days. Why? Some people say that the leadership had lost its nerve, that they refused to fire on Soviet citizens who resisted them. Some people attribute the failure of the coup to Mr. Yeltsin's bravery. Remember the scene in the square in front of the White House. This is the Soviet, not the Soviet, but the Russian parliament building in Moscow, where Mr. Yeltsin appeared on top of a tank, and he declared this coup to be illegal. In a recent interesting book, in fact, it's just out this month, Amy Knight, who's a very fine historian of the KGB and a shrewd observer of the Soviet and now the Russian post-Soviet scene, has argued that the coup, so-called, was perhaps not as it appeared at the time. In fact, she says that Gorbachev played along with the members of the emergency committee, the putschists. Gorbachev gave them to understand that they could seize power and that he would then return once he'd recovered from his illness to Moscow and take control. And Amy Knight says, although the evidence is circumstantial here, that Gorbachev would be a winner either way. He would be a winner if the coup succeeded and he could return to Moscow, a winner if the coup collapsed and then he could be restored to his rightful position. And she says that what he didn't count on was that Mr. Yeltsin would very effectively seize the moment and advertise himself as the main barrier to the reinstallation of the old regime. Well, this is a very intelligent book. It is a book worth reading. I myself am not persuaded by either of the accounts at this point. I think that it will take a while before we have a definitive picture of the aims of the conspiracy, why it collapsed, and so on. I would like to see a large portion of the 150 volumes of testimony that the conspirators, so-called, were made to give to the judiciary. I would like to see a good portion of that published by reputable historians with annotations before I would make up my mind. And of course, the stakes for us are rather high in this interpretation. If you assume that Yeltsin resisted the coup and it was his heroism and his commitment to democracy that publicly embarrassed the old regime and faced it down, then you might have a more optimistic view about a Russia led by Yeltsin. If, on the other hand, you simply see Yeltsin as an opportunist and so on, then his behavior looks not so heroic. If he knew that the coup was orchestrated, that he had been warned ahead of time, and he had a presentiment it was going to fail, then he might be just a populist plumping himself up and burnishing his reputation. So there are stakes here that are important. I think more important than the public relations victory of the democratic forces, so-called, over the coup was what transpired afterwards. What transpired afterwards was that when Mr. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, he was immediately put on the defensive by journalists who suspected that he might have a hand in this conspiracy, that this might be one of those Gorbachevian games that they had become accustomed to, that Gorbachev had done behind the scenes what he could not achieve in reality, which was to block the implementation of the Union Treaty, which was supposed to reconfigure the relationship between the various republics and the central power. Gorbachev, before August, had promised Yeltsin that he would sign the treaty, the Union Treaty, in August, and the timing of the coup was related to the solution of the nationality question. Well, the journalists were suspicious, and Yeltsin sensed a kill. He sensed the possibility of seizing the political upper hand, and so he embarrassed Gorbachev publicly. It was a stunning reversal because Gorbachev, who up to this point had had all the better over Yeltsin, was now embarrassed before the public, and he lost his public relations war as he had lost in the economic sphere and many other spheres. In December of 1991, there was what I would call a second coup d'etat. And this one was successful, but it was a silent coup. And it was not treated in the West, really, as a coup, but I believe this is what it was. Kravchuk, the head of Ukraine, the head of the Belarusian Republic, and Mr. Yeltsin went for a walk in the woods, just the three of them, to chat about what should be the political situation that they would like to see in the country in the next year. They concluded that it was intolerable that Gorbachev remain as president of the Soviet Union. They concluded that they could not work with Gorbachev. And they decided, amongst the three of them, that the separate republics would now go their way as independent nations. With the simultaneous removal of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia from the Soviet Union, the Union's life was forfeit. So you see, the nationality question was the Achilles heel of the Soviet Union, although disappointment over the control of the command economy and the political debates about democratization had certainly contributed immeasurably to the disintegration of the old order. Now, what followed the formal dissolution of the USSR in Christmas of 1991 was in Russia, this is our concern at the moment, was something approaching a national rebirth. But it was hesitating, it was partial, and all the while that Russia was trying to rediscover its old identity and fashion a new one, there were interesting little steps, maneuvers that Mr. Yeltsin made to make closer cooperation possible with the other states that had been formerly republics of the Soviet Union. And by 1995-96, these steps had grown to be so clear and to resemble so much a reintegration of the Soviet Union that one is hard-pressed to say whether what is happening before our eyes is the rebirth of Russia or the rebirth of the Soviet Union without the Soviet. The rebirth, in other words, of a federation or confederation of nations together, the integration of them into something like the old Republican format with some leadership in Moscow extending to the others. But we don't know the degree of coherence of this body yet. We don't know how far these steps will go, and so we face the future as always unknowing and mystified. What we can clarify, it seems to me, is something about what has happened in Russia. I would like to talk about very briefly the rebirth of Russian culture, such as it is, and Russian traditions. I want to say something about Yeltsin's leadership and his policies, because at least these things we can know with some degree of certainty. In post-Soviet Russia, there is a revival of old symbols, many of them imperial symbols, imperial in their origins, dating, that is, to the period of Peter the Great, to the end of Nicholas II's life, 18th and 19th centuries. Pre-revolutionary names were returned to cities, so that one no longer spoke of Gorky, the city, one spoke of Nizhny Novgorod. Or in Leningrad, one didn't speak of Leningrad, one didn't speak of Petrograd, one spoke again of Petersburg. Inside of the big cities, where there was formerly a street, let's say, with the name of Prospect Marx or Prospect Engels, suddenly one found overnight that the pre-revolutionary names had been returned. And this was something in which formerly Soviet citizens, now Russian citizens, took a great deal of civic pride. It seemed to them right that with the change of the country's leadership and with the change of its institutions, that there should be an outward and symbolical change in city names and street names. Some imperial monuments were to be rebuilt. For example, Mr. Yeltsin committed an enormous amount of the national treasure, shouldn't even say national treasure because the Russian government was pretty much broke. So he committed future state budgets to the rebuilding of the Church of Christ the Savior, that church which in 1931 had been blown up by Stalin. And now it would be rechristened, as it were. Instead of a church memorializing the Russian victory over Napoleon in 1812, it would now be a church that would memorialize Russia's repentance at what had happened under Stalin. An old flag, the flag of the provisional government in 1917, was chosen to be the national flag of Russia. It's an interesting choice because in that brief period when the provisional government existed, there was something like democracy and political freedom. At least that's what the authorities wanted Russians to believe. Older symbols were appropriated as well. For example, St. George and the dragon. Dragon being slain by George on a horse was appropriated mostly by right-wing parties, but you could find Russians in the Yeltsin government wearing pins of St. George and putting banners of St. George up, and so on. Intellectuals made an effort to revive Russian literary and philosophical traditions. There was a rediscovery of pre-Marxist philosophy. So, for example, the Russian religious philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, great philosopher who died in 1900, was considered a prodigy in his time. His work was revived. A work of other lesser-known disciples of Solovyov also was republished, and people talked about the Russian national traditions, once again holding sway in this field. Some politicians talked about reinstitutionalizing old forms of administration. For example, Mr. Rutskoy, who was Yeltsin's vice president, said, it would be good to see if we could revive the zemstvo. These were local land councils that were called into existence in 1864. And Mr. Rudskoy thought that the zemstvos, which were elective bodies at the local level, would have a good deal more life in them than the Soviets, which is a form that he thought had outlived its existence. There was talk about a constitutional convention. Remember, early on, Russia was operating without a constitution. It was in a legal no man's land because the old Soviet constitution had ceased to have force since the Union had ceased to exist, and there wasn't a republican constitution which would describe even the existing arrangements appropriately. So a new constitution would have to be fashioned, and therefore there was talk about a constituent assembly. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote books and articles and more books about the Russian question, and he pressed his solutions on the constituency out there as well. And interestingly, Solzhenitsyn said that the Slavs should give up on the empire. It was nothing but a burden. He called for a Slavic bratstvo, a Slavic brotherhood consisting of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And he assumed that even if for a while these three brothers went their way, that they would return and constitute the core of a new union eventually. Well, all of this was in the intellectual air, and meanwhile, Mr. Yeltsin had to make policy. Mr. Yeltsin's an interesting character. He's feisty, he's combative. One good person, historian, and shrewd observer of the scene said to me that Yeltsin and Gorbachev are like two bantam roosters, constantly going at each other. And there's something of the bantam in Yeltsin's bearing. Yeltsin is contemptuous of his opponents. You've got absolutely nothing good to say about Gorbachev, despite Gorbachev's signal achievements. I mean, Gorbachev's reforms really made possible Yeltsin's ascendancy, whether Yeltsin liked him as a person or not. Yeltsin is a riverboat gambler. If we assume that it was heroic to stand on the tank, this was a gamble. He listened to Fyodor Gaidar, who told him that you better let prices float. Yeltsin went right along with this. So this is a man that can take risks. And such a personality is important in a time of rapid change. Mr. Yeltsin is also a recluse, somebody that withdraws for long periods from public life, and it's very worrisome to his entourage. He's self-destructive. He has a well-known problem with alcoholism. I could give you chapter and verse on this, but I will refrain and say that he does have a battle with the demon vodka that he has to fight. He's ambitious for himself and ambitious for his country. All of these attitudes worked very well for him for a time. For this reason, common Russians identified with him. They saw him as a flawed politician. Sure, he drinks. Sure, he goes and disappears on benders. But in what way is he different than we are? And these people in 1990 were taking collectively an enormous risk. They were seeing the security blanket of the Soviet system, such as it was, wholly torn here and there, discarded in front of their eyes, and they were now without security, facing the future. This was an enormous risk. So these aspects of Yeltsin's personality are expressions, prismatic expressions of what is the Russian temperament at this moment in history. In my opinion, now there will be people that will argue here, I do not think that Yeltsin is now or was ever a principled Democrat. I think that, like Gorbachev, he was attracted to the rhetoric of reform and democracy because he was frustrated with the ability of the party to deliver goods and services. But this is a man that was formed inside the apparat. He was a kind of, well, what's the word? A satrap, somebody who at the local level in Sverdlovsk ruled with an iron hand. And his behavior in power does not suggest that his lodestar is democracy. For example, in his first year of rule, he accepted from the existing Russian parliament the right to rule by decree. Now, a real Democrat, I submit, would not have taken such a right and acted on it. At the end of the year, he fought against his Russian parliament in order to restore his right to rule by decree. In other words, he wanted to dispense with the legislature entirely. After 1993, after the parliament was shot up by tanks and the new constitution had to be written, Yeltsin wrote a constitution that gave exceptionally wide range of powers to the presidency and practically hamstrung the legislature. So by the Western understanding of the word Democrat, I think, Yeltsin is not one. Think also of October 1993, another dramatic event that we recognize. I alluded to it a second ago. Yeltsin was opposed by his own vice president, by the Speaker of the Russian Parliament, by a number of others who said the economic reforms aren't working. And the political showdown between these groups led to a Russian president ordering tanks to bombard the White House. Now, symbolically speaking, the burnt out shell of the 7th floor of the White House, all of the black soot on that white marble exterior, it seems to me gives you a pretty adequate picture of Yeltsin's principled, or rather unprincipled, commitment to democracy. December 94, the regime committed itself to a war in Chechnya. It did so without the approval of parliament. It was a presidential war, and it has been waged by the army and by the executive. And I think that Yeltsin has been duplicitous, frankly, in his assurances that, oh yes, we will have a ceasefire, we will cease to attack this or that village, we will negotiate in good faith. I think, unfortunately, that he has simply lied about his intentions. And this is a Soviet manner of behavior manifesting itself now in a post-Soviet politician. And this is why I think that it is a mistake, despite the passage of 40 years and more, to think that the Soviet peoples, now the former Soviet peoples, have exorcised from themselves Stalin's ghost. The spirit of the high-handed, centralizing, belligerent policies of Joseph Vissarionovich is going to be the hardest thing for the Russians to shake. And whether they will shake it or not, we cannot say. Now, let me mention to you two other areas in which Yeltsin has been active as a policymaker. I think they are relevant to his historical legacy and to the future of Russia. Russia, you see, is a post-imperial empire. You say, now, how can you be a post-imperial empire? Well, the Soviet Union was a large empire, and the various republics have split off. So that part of the empire disappearing makes Russia a remnant, a post-imperial remnant. But Russia itself internally is an empire. It is a multinational state. It is divided into regions where ethnic groups seek advantage, autonomy. In the case of the Chechens, who are inside Russia, they seek independence. So post-imperial empire is exactly what the Russian polity is at the moment. Now, Yeltsin's policy at first was encouraging. He said that Russia as a state wouldn't interfere with the internal affairs of the other post-Soviet nations. Yeltsin has tried to accommodate, to a certain extent, especially in the first period, the feelings of the non-Russian peoples inside of Russia. And he's done this in a way that we wouldn't be aware of because of our English ears. When he comes on national television, he doesn't address citizens in the audience as Russkie, that is, as Russians in the ethnic sense. He uses the term Россияне, that is, as citizens of Russia, whatever their makeup, ethnically. In other words, he's trying to do what the Soviet government tried to do for so long in the Soviet context. He's trying to build a Russian nationalism that is above ethnicity, that is supra-ethnic. This was the first phase of his policy. Some of it, like the use of the term Россияне, continues. But lately, 93, 94, 95 especially, Yeltsin has been much more assertive on the periphery of Russia. There have been various interventions in Georgian politics on the side of factions that are supportive of Russian national interests. There have been attempts to fashion treaties to reintegrate the old union on new terms, especially with Belarus, which is a weakly developed nation state with a weak economy. They have been especially pliable in the hands of Russian diplomats. There has been a concerted effort to reestablish the center's power in Russia, so that, for example, if you take the Chechen case, I think this could have been resolved by peaceful means if Yeltsin had visualized Russia as a decentralized polity. But I think he visualizes it as a centralized policy with a powerful state. And to the Chechens who wanted autonomy and who wanted to leave, ultimately, Russia, he threw down the gauntlet because he knows that behind the Chechens, standing in line, are Tatars and many other nationalities that would like to see independence for themselves. In other words, Mr. Yeltsin has reasserted the needs of the old great Russian state. And when you do that, it becomes not implausible to think of an empire growing again and looking something like, in some respects, the Tsarist Empire or the Soviet Empire. Again, without the Soviet institution. What about the problem of capitalism? We saw last time that Mr. Gorbachev faced political issues, he faced the nationality question, and he faced the problem of the free market. Well, Yeltsin faced these problems too. We have seen that he wasn't probably really a Democrat. We have seen his basket of solutions to the nationality question, and now we look at his attitude toward capitalism. Between 91 and 95, Yeltsin, it seems to me, was incontestably pro-market in many respects, in most respects. January of 1992, at Mr. Gaidar's advice, Yeltsin permitted prices to be decontrolled. So this means that the state no longer sets prices. They are set by supply and demand, and there was runaway inflation immediately, and it still continues, this inflation. He established the principle of a convertible ruble. The ruble would have to find its level on the international monetary exchange, and it would be, in principle, convertible, so that one could buy dollars, Deutschmarks, exchange back and forth. All these things were necessary to establish a real market with real money. Yeltsin encouraged privatization. I remember in the summer of '92, people were confronted for the first time with the option to be the owners of their apartments. I mean, you could secede from a state-owned cooperative and you could have title to your apartment. Now, in the short run, this just meant that instead of the state being responsible for fixing the pipes, you were responsible for fixing the pipes. And a lot of people balked at this. In September of '92, privatization vouchers were issued. And what this did was give workers in certain state enterprises a share in ownership of corporations. Now, of course, these shares were bought up by the managers of the corporations, and so the workers got very little in return, but the principle of privatization was established. And then Mr. Yeltsin attempted to break up the collective farm system, to make possible private ownership of land and agriculture, and I would say steps were made in that direction, but the policy has yet to stick. Now, there were consequences to these reforms. The command economy was destroyed. It was destroyed. It's also the case, it seems to me, that a private market of some indeterminable size has been established. But on the ruins of the old system, there grew up a new economic system that you might call mafia capitalism. The mafias in Russia predate the dissolution of the USSR. They actually were based on the old patronage networks of the republics. And they were party people who operated with protection of the KGB, and they supplied chicken to restaurants in Moscow, or cotton to certain industries, and so on. The absence of a strong state and of strong legal control has meant the flourishing of these pre-existent mafias and the creation of new ones. So if you go to Moscow now, it is not uncommon to see people with guns outside of establishments and so on. And in politics, there is an unholy alliance between the bankers and political parties. Money is the mother's milk of politics. We Americans know this well, and the Russians are learning it now themselves. With the growth of this market, there is a growth of social antagonisms. Market always means winners, and it means losers. There is an impoverished pensioner class that will probably vote communist in the June elections. There are impoverished young families. There are homeless people in Russia. And this is a visible consequence of the market reforms. There's no doubt about it. There are also people that are doing well. that are consuming conspicuously. This is what happens in a market society. Can the Russians, after so many years, 74 years of Soviet power, can they adjust to this reality? Only time can tell. I cannot tell you. In conclusion, Russia is a place where authoritarian habits linger. The imperial mentality is not dead, where anti-market sentiments make a volatile mixture. It's a place where political catastrophe could happen, but it's also a place, since 1953, where astonishing progress that no Westerner and no Russian could have predicted has occurred. So the balance between hope and tragedy is now about even, and we will see in our lifetimes which way the balance tips.